Welcome to the Tank Roll Actions Guide. Here I'm going to go into a newbie level, but in-depth look at each of the roll actions tanks have. All roll actions should be treated like an extension of your skill set, being equally important to your party's survival. As the first and last line of defense, it's important to have a basic grasp on the uses of these skills. Tanks have 7 of them, which is the largest set of roll actions in the entire game, so it's a lot to take in at once, but let's get started. At level 8, we have our first roll action, Rampart. This is the first defensive cooldown all tanks get. When in combat, this usually ends up being your go-to defensive buff. On a 90-second cooldown, Rampart reduces damage by 20% for 20 seconds. This might seem like a small buff, but as you level up, you'll learn just how much of a difference 20% makes, especially for tank busters. Tank busters are attacks that are meant to do major damage to, or potentially outright kill a tank. I'll give a specific example now. Let's take this endgame raid boss. I have roughly 50,000 health, but the tank buster of this boss does about 42,000, with some damage variance. That is most of my health. If I get hit without my health being maxed, I will instantly die. I still might die even if I'm at max health, due to an auto attack right after, which in endgame can be doing 1/5 of your health per hit at minimum, depending on the fight. So, let's use Rampart. That 42,000 becomes only about 33,000. I can now survive from below max health and maybe even be able to take an auto attack afterwards. I specifically chose a late game example to illustrate the point, but it's useful in early levels too, especially for trash mobs. Let's say you have about 50,000 health and you grab a bunch of enemies. Maybe too many enemies for you to handle, and they do about 6,500 damage per second. This means after only 8 seconds, you will die. So let's pop Rampart. Your incoming damage is now 5,000 damage per second, and you can now survive about 10 seconds without being healed before you die. This is almost extra time enough to get an entire global cooldown in. Even 2 seconds is enough to make a huge difference. This should accurately illustrate why you should use Rampart, as well as all of your defensive cooldowns as you learn them. This will also be your only defensive cooldown for a while, further incentivizing you to learn how to use it now. One final note, typically be sure to use cooldowns after you pull, not before. There are exceptions, but typically wasting timer on the buffs before you pull is just that, a waste. Level 12 gives us Low Blow. This skill is going to be a lot more situational. It has an extremely short cooldown of 25 seconds. This will stun a target for 5 seconds with diminishing returns. The second stun will only be 3 seconds long, and a third will be 1 second. From this point on, the target will be entirely immune to stuns, with a rare exception. Making good use of Low Blow requires a lot more experimenting than other skills. In general, it's a free 5 seconds of making most normal enemies and most early game bosses stop hurting you. The best use of this skill I find is stopping certain enemy AoEs. The best and earliest example of this is at level 28 in Hawk Manor. The very first enemy of this dungeon is a succubus that does a very large AoE with a big punishment if you get hit by it, stunning you for 10 seconds. Instead of trying to run away from this, just use Low Blow. Later on, some enemies are even more rewarding to stun. Sometimes, they lose out on some buffs, or it's high level content and it's a required stun. One more example I'll give is a boss. This boss will start shooting poison puddles at random players partway into the fight. If you learn the timing, you can stun the boss the moment he goes to use it. The puddles hurt the player, any players in the area around the target, give poison debuffs to anyone hit, are permanent puddles for the rest of the fight, and will heal him if he stands in the puddle. This is 5 different reasons to stun the boss for this one singular attack. It's a low level boss, so the punishment for not stunning it is actually very low, but yet it teaches you early on how beneficial properly timed stuns can be. Start experimenting early, and maybe ask your party members or your friends for all the possible uses for stun in whatever dungeon you're doing. In time for the first dungeon, we get Provoke at level 15. This skill is mostly for high-end stuff, but has some uses now. On a 30-second cooldown, it guarantees you become the enmity lead for an enemy, and gives you a few extra points of enmity. How many? Well, a lot. You still need to keep attacking to maintain enmity though, which, for those who don't know, enmity is another word for threat or aggro, as used in other games. Whoever has the most threat is the target for the enemy. Summarily, this attack makes the enemy always start attacking you. Very rare exceptions apply. In dungeon content, Provoke has two uses. My favorite use is using it to pull packs of mobs from a distance. The range of Provoke is 66% larger than that of your ranged pulling attack. Pulling from a further distance on its own is not much of a benefit, since you may have to progress through the dungeon anyway. Reducing the walk distance to the enemies by a tiny bit just means a tiny bit more walking distance later. However, many dungeons have close together packs of enemies that are safe to pull at the same time, but are far apart enough to be difficult to pull with your ranged attack. Or it could be a dungeon with lots of patrolling enemies. For example, here we have the very feared Arm Veil. Most of this first room is mobs that patrol the area, or are otherwise blocking progress. Let's take this frog. If it aggroes you, it pulls you in, but using Provoke, we can pull it away before it does so, keeping us safe from the patrolling enemies. The other major use in dungeons is after you die. When you die, your enmity drops to 0. Provoke will gain you back the enmity lead immediately, taking the boss or enemy away from allies. Just be sure your healer is able to heal you too. Maybe pop a cooldown, since you raise with very low HP. As for the later uses at level 50 and beyond, we start getting 8-man trials where there will be 2 tanks. Starting off, we will rarely need Provoke, but the harder extreme fights, please do not solo queue these, they're actually really hard, please don't. And fights starting at 60 for hard mode fights will start having tank swaps. A tank swap is exactly what it sounds like. The tank in charge of the boss swaps. Usually, this is forced by some very powerful vulnerability up caused by the tank busters. For an example, the Flame Breath in this extreme fight is giving me stacks of damage up that last for 30 seconds, capping at 5 stacks. This is the tank swap mechanic here. When doing the fight properly, you do not have the health to just stay at 5 stacks. He's doing tank busters for over 3,000 damage even in my level 80 gear set. Your max HP at level 50 is only going to be around 10,000 with high gear. This is about as extreme as the example I gave for Rampart, even more so when you remember it will happen at least once every 30 seconds. Now as I said, this is an extreme fight. Hard fights and any other lower level content are a lot more reasonable. Failing those tank swaps are usually far less punishing, but there's no better example than an extreme example, no pun intended. Next up, we have the level 18 skill, Interject. Interject is the cousin to Low Blow. On a 30-second cooldown, this will interrupt a target. This is not the same as stunning. While any skill can be stopped if an enemy is susceptible to stuns, only specific skills can be interrupted. Let's head back into Hawk and visit one of the bosses. Notice the pulsing progress bar up here with the enemy health bar. This is what denotes something as silenceable. Much like stuns, you will have to learn where to use interrupts as you go, or ask people about where to use them. There are very few required uses of this skill, but there are some very useful ones, and one of the best is in an early Shadowbringers dungeon. But that's all the way at 73. For now, keep an eye out for this pulsing progress bar, and learn what can be silenced as you go. With level 22, we get Reprisal. On a 60-second recast, this is a small AoE around you that reduces the damage of enemies by 10%. Use this similarly to Rampart. Gather all of your enemies up, then Reprisal to reduce all of their damage. This is also a good skill to pair with other cooldowns for tank busters, or for raid-wide damage. To give an example again, in the final fight of a raid tier, typically, your average raid-wide will one-shot everyone but tanks without some form of mitigation, or even multiple forms of mitigation. Reprisal is almost always one of those forms of mitigation. Mitigating damage like this is still extremely important in the easier content though. While it's nowhere near as lethal as failing to use it in high-end content, it will still greatly reduce the amount of healing your healers will have to do. Ultimately, that's what all cooldown usage can be boiled down to. Minimizing incoming damage so your healers have an easier time keeping you alive, or the entire party alive in the case of Reprisal. This skill can help everyone. At level 32, we have Arm's Length. On a 120-second cooldown, you'll have 6 seconds of this buff, and it has 2 effects. The first is nullifying most knockback and draw-in effects. Back to our fire friend. His big fire pulse knocks us back. Arm's Length prevents this, allowing us to keep pressure on him and prevent him from moving from where we had him. But keep in mind the most part. I emphasize this because of the exceptions becoming very obvious when you experience one, especially if you die to it. As of making this guide, a lot of the newer fights do not allow for the use of Arm's Length to prevent knockbacks. This could be a sign that Arm's Length will start seeing less use in higher levels as the game gets older, as opposed to previous years where most attacks would always allow for Arm's Length usage. The other effect makes this a cooldown you can use for trash pulls. For 15 seconds, any foe who struck you during the duration of Arm's Length will have a 20% slow effect placed on them. This is not movement speed, but attack speed. This doesn't outright reduce the power of enemies, but reduces how frequently they can hit you, while also giving your healer a slightly longer time to heal you before you die. It's your weakest cooldown, but it's still very useful for trash pulls, especially for big groups of enemies. Do try to make the best of this skill. Our final role action is all the way at level 48, Shirk. Shirk is on a 120-second cooldown and gives 25% of all your enmity to the target party member. This skill has a singular use, and that is aiding in tank swaps. There are no other times you should be using this, so I'm going to illustrate the flow of your typical tank swap now. When we begin, one tank will have the enmity lead, and the other will not. The tank without enmity lead, now called the off tank, will turn on their tank stance if it is not already on. The tank with enmity lead, now called the main tank, will want to turn it off at some point, either now or during the next few steps. The off tank will then provoke, becoming the enmity lead. The main tank will then shirk after the provoke, greatly increasing the enmity distance between the two players. The main tank and off tank will have now swapped. At this point, if not already done so, the new off tank should turn off tank stance as not to steal enmity back by accident, especially if they're about to burst in high DPS. Keep in mind, you should both be attacking through this whole setup, like in this striking dummy example. That is why the timing of all of this is key, and is a bit more difficult than just outright saying how it is done. Like I said before, tank swapping is rarely needed outside of extreme trials and raid content, but be prepared to use Provoke and Shirk when the need arises. One final note for all role actions is level sync does not remove them. Once you hit the level needed to use role actions at any point, it stays usable even at the lowest sync points. With that covers all 7 of the tank role actions. Thank you for watching my tank roll actions guide. Hopefully this has demonstrated the importance of your roll actions. Be sure to ask any questions on anything you don't understand or may not have been covered in this video. Make use as best you can of your entire toolkit and keep those enemies smack in your face as you smack them dead. May the power of an Nidhogg's lay waste to your enemies.